What optics have become is a whole lot more about putting together a presentation that will make you popular, gain followers, subscribers, likes, positive comments, and all of that so you can feel good about yourself. The problem is what you put out to feel good about yourself isn't yourself. It's somebody else. So the whole game we're playing is a fake game to get a real reaction. Tell me, how's that going to work? How's that ever going to work?
Hello and welcome to The Naked Gospel, where we have conversations about sex, singleness, marriage, pornography, and everything in between. We bring on cultural thinkers, parents, important folk, and normal folk alike. I am your host, Shane O'Neill. If you're listening in, video versions of all of these episodes are available at YouTube, Proven Ministries. We have that below. If you're watching, you just rather listen in, then all of these episodes are available on every major podcast platform. Whether you're listening or watching, do subscribe and continue to track with us. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy the episode. Hey folks, thank you for joining us again on The Naked Gospel. As many of you know, sexual integrity doesn't happen in a vacuum. It impacts our relationships, kind of mediums of communication, whether it's digital, or written or whatever. Just a lot of it where humans are holistic. And as we've talked on before, when I look at the way this culture expects me to live and to function, I find myself often disconnected from my own body and disconnected from relationships. Kind of the staple image is a bunch of people out to dinner who are all on their phones, connecting with people who aren't there. It's a stereotype for sure, but I've seen myself fill that stereotype. And so I want to understand better what technology and mediums are doing to me. I want to know better how to anchor myself relationally. I want to know people, and I want to know myself and God's Spirit within me. So anyways, we've asked this guy named Rob Singleton. Rob is a pastor out in Colorado. He'll be telling us about that shortly, but he's also written a book. It's called Overliked. If you can see that, there is the cover. We'll have a link to it down below, where he engages finding direction, courage, and meaningful relationships in a society crippled by social media. So we're just going to talk through that because it is a primary medium of our existence. A lot of us intuitively see our bodies as vehicles instead of as abodes for God's Spirit, as temples. And so learning to kind of recalibrate what it means to have a relationship, what it means to be embodied, is something that I'm fascinated by and something that helps me live the kind of life that I long to and to know Jesus in the ways that he invites me to. So, Rob, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Man, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about yourself, but also tell us kind of the genesis and inspiration for this book. I know it's been kind of a long time coming. You've been working on it for a few years.
Genesis of it was maybe even something I'm not particularly proud of. I pastored a church in North Carolina. Actually, my wife and I planted 3 churches and then helped plant 7 others. So in our youth, we were able to do that. Planting a church is the hardest thing I've ever done. But as our main church really grew from our family room of about 8 people to different campuses and thousands of people, and then social media was hitting the scene, I got caught in a trap that concerned me so much that I thought, if a pastor can get caught in this trap so easily and, start worrying about likes and followers and, what the pastor down the street's doing or why people are going down there, and then can hear other pastors get caught up in this, what in the world is happening with Christians that we're supposed to shepherd, that we're supposed to lead? If we're struggling, they're definitely struggling. And so I really began to, look at it just from within. I wondered why likes mattered so much. I wondered why, critical comments hurt so much. I wondered why I was being more careful than I should have been to put an image of myself forward that I thought people would like, maybe even more of or less of a completely honest image. Sometimes people put pictures of themselves that are 10 years old out there to, because they think they looked better when they were younger. Just all kinds of optics were getting really strange. And I usually tell people this. I've done so many of these podcasts and radio, and it's really heated up recently because, Facebook just came out, this nationwide indictment of Facebook because they're really hurting kids. It's all over the news now, and they're using their algorithm to really, really bait people to just pour their whole lives into this. And it's having an effect. It's having a very detrimental effect. It's dividing people. It's causing disunity. And so all of a sudden, this Christian book written, kind of sitting in a corner, people are taking notice of it. It's almost like I sort of cried out years ago about this and people hadn't seen the problem. So I put it like this. Our first house my wife and I bought was a synthetic stucco house in North Carolina, and it promised to save money on heat and cooling because it was so well sealed. And it was just a house everybody wanted 30 years ago. And about 5 years into it, if you live in a humid climate, we found out that it was insulated so well that the wood, the frames were rotting. And so people were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair their house. So this thing that looks so good on the front end ended up costing way, way more on the back end. So I think social media that made a lot of promises on the front end. I love technology. I love leveraging it to reach people. But now a lot of Christians, a lot of people are beginning to see the wheels coming off this thing. If you don't use it correctly, or if you allow it to use you, I think it's causing a lot of damage. And I'm not saying go back to the days of Downton Abbey or anything like that, because that ship has sailed. But we better be careful about how we use this, or it's going to become a little shrine or a little worship center for us, our little social media platforms. There's more to say, but that's really what, I think I was an early adopter of this, but I also, among my peers, was, I think, one of the first ones to really see the damage.
Rob, can you run us through the stats? Because somebody listening might be thinking, I reckon a lot of people listening might be thinking, is this really a problem? And that question's intuitive because it's the water that we swim in. It's the air that we breathe. So I do remember the first time I held an iPhone. So I am a digital immigrant in certain ways, but it was in high school, and I've had so many years of formation with that thing in my hand and kind of portable internet wherever I go. There are a lot of digital natives, people who don't, they just grew up with this as kind of a given. But I know you've looked at loneliness, you've looked at mental health, those sorts of things, and the impact that social media has upon our neurology. So would you help play some of that out for us?
Well, I think it was meant maybe as a criticism, but it's turned into a big plus, is that a lot of people have read the book and said, man, you got so many footnotes in this thing. That's almost a separate book, reading through all of those. There's a lot of studies from Ivy League institutions, from psychology magazines and periodicals, and I'm not able to recall a lot of them right now. I can probably just pull it up from the book. But I think better than going to that, let's go to an event that really blew it up. And that's the pandemic. We were starting to see a problem, but when people were locked into their houses and they were already spending 3 or 4 hours a day on social media, but they were able to, kids were able to go to school, they were able to play sports, they were able to do a lot of things. But when they were locked in their houses, that screen time went from about 3 hours to, on average, this is going to sound ridiculous, but 10, 12 hours a day. And if you look at that, for a lot of people, they're not awake much more than that. So what's really happening is I've got my smartphone right here. I always do, but for a lot of people, it's glued to them. They are now, a good percentage of people go to bed with their phone. They have their AirPods in their ears. They're listening to music as they fall asleep. They might be watching TV shows in other words, they're not without it. So suicide rates went up. I think while the world focused on being careful with COVID and making sure we were safe from that. It seems like everything else that could damage us went through the roof and nobody paid attention to it. Depression with kids, the inability to communicate in person. So as we go back to school, people have kind of forgotten how to have face-to-face conversations. People have forgotten, if they do have face-to-face conversations, they've forgotten how to look people in the eye. They've forgotten how to be authentic. They don't even know what real means. I'm not trying to say they as in 100% of people, but living in a little bubble for a year, and for some people, a year and a half. And if you're in Australia or something like that, you're back in it again. Each time we emerge from this thing, we don't know how to live off the screen. Statistically, it's not funny. I was going to say funny, like peculiar, bizarre to me why people don't pay attention to suicide rates, pay attention to depression, pay attention to disengagement or drugs to help kids focus more, or ADHD or OCD, or all these things that were already epidemic, but now they're off the charts. And they're not putting that together with just, hurting people into a room and saying your entire life's going to be online. Listen, you can't even have a business meeting. Now that's done on Zoom. How are we doing this right now on Zoom? I mean, we're not even in person right now. So, it's funny. I don't know how old this Facebook story is. I get the feeling it's only 3 or 4. It's pretty new. I don't even know if you're that familiar with it. But right now, the whistleblower, as they're calling her, this lady has testified today before Congress. And, this is the single biggest event of pulling back the curtain on Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. In fact, they all went down yesterday for about 4 hours. And so this thing is really being exposed. And at the same time, I've seen sales and interest in the book over like go up. And I think that's because people are, they're looking to secular media, they're looking to news, they're looking to politicians, they're looking to psychologists for answers. And it almost feels like they're being paid not to give you answers, sort of to talk around the subject. And so now, just like with churches reopening, now people are going to God and they're saying, just give me the truth. Somebody tell me what damage this is doing to me, because I can clearly see that things aren't the same. I want to get authenticity. I want to get real relationships. I want to fix my life, but I don't feel like the world's got the answers, or if they do, they're not being honest about it.
Yeah, and a buddy was telling me just a few days ago, he was showing me the Instagram for kids and how they've postponed that development Instagram has because of research and studies. And I know, so I struggle with eye contact. And I do correlate a lot of that with the things that capture my eyes. Primarily pixelized mediums. I know that in certain Western countries, they're starting to do studies because when a baby is born, a mother's initial impulse is to take a picture. And they started noticing it because in the pictures, the baby would be trying to make eye contact with the mother, and the mother's looking over here at a phone. And so oxytocin's released when there's eye contact, even amongst adults. And that baby needs that connection with the mother needs that connection with the baby. It's neurologically formational. And they're starting to see how the neglect of even eye contact is impacting us neurologically. And so they are asking the questions, what is captivating our eyes and thus impacting our neurobiology. Which I think is interesting and goes to what you're saying, because Steve Jobs famously wouldn't let his kids have an iPad, right? Like a lot of these people who created these platforms wouldn't let their kids use it. And in a sense, it goes back to kind of drug culture, like don't ever get high on your own supply. Like they're distributing this stuff, they're manufacturing it, creating it, innovating it, but they wouldn't ever let their own kids use it, which is fascinating. So I want to hear you speak a little bit more into, because you mentioned this in the beginning, how we've almost made a technological recognition a virtue. when it comes to Twitter, when it comes to Instagram. A lot of people find their identity, and you take quite a bit of time of talking about optics and spinning in this book. So when it comes to presentation, because we really have made that kind of a virtue of presentation, of image, of representation. Be interested to hear your thoughts on how that's shaping us. And you do present an alternative in that chapter. Would love to hear you just talk about that a bit.
The first time I noticed this word's popularity, I mean, the word is about 200 years old. You go back to Galileo, and you go back to some people that actually coined this phrase optics. It doesn't mean anything near what we're using it as today, but you first started noticing this maybe 7, 8 years ago on Twitter. And so people would make a comment. And what's interesting is that people are making a comment, and they're talking about not hearing a comment, obviously, because it's Twitter, but seeing a comment, reading it. And you would begin to see responses like, hey, dude, you better stop and consider the optics of what you just said. And what they meant was, hey, that doesn't fly. That's going to get you canceled, all kinds of stuff. So people are getting more careful about what they say, whether it's honest or not. So what happens now is people are putting out optics that will favorably move them forward, or not get them canceled, or not incite a mob, or this kind of thing. Or the other side of it is they're putting out optics that they think people want to see. So TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, your profile, the things that are written about you are not so much honest or authentic as they are, hey, let me find out what's selling in my demographic. What do people want to hear? I'm going to put out optics that tell them that's what I am, even if that's absolutely not what you are. I think one of the things I write in a chapter is really sad. Somebody that I knew from high school, and this was years ago, but still it was about 15 years after high school, they had a picture as their current profile picture that was when they were like 20. You got to understand, they're 35. And I'm not going to say too much more because somebody might be listening. They were fairly popular and fairly well known, but it was because of how they looked. And I think that they were worried that they had aged and people wouldn't like them as much because of the changing optics. So the danger in optics is, as we come before the Lord, or as we come before our brothers and sisters or friends or family, and we really want them to like us and know us for who we are, what chance do we have of that happening if everything we're putting out is not who we are? So we feel this pressure to put out a fake or a pleasing optic, written, visually, filtered, airbrushed, all this stuff. And then what happens when you see people face to face and that doesn't match? People are starting to see this on things like Tinder and these dating apps. People work so hard to craft an image, and what happens when you go out on a real date and you're sitting there, at a restaurant or something, and everything you faked is exposed. And here's where it boils down. We're made in the image of God. Way back to the beginning, we're made in God's image, and people forget that part of that image is that God has always existed as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's Orthodox Christianity. And so part of that image is community. So I always say it like this: we were made for community by community. And so, when we try to get closer to God, or when we try to get closer to how he made us authentically, part of that is getting into real authentic community. We weren't made to be lone rangers. And yet this whole social media world, really pushes to make you an expert at being a lone ranger, an expert at doing community behind a screen, not real community, not face-to-face community, but you can sit in your parents' basement in your pajamas and completely create a persona in there that never has to go out. But like I said, you're created for real face-to-face community. And eventually you're going to have to go out to get that fulfillment of the way God made you. And you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to function. You're not going to be able to have a conversation. This is, you tell me, how often have you gone to a restaurant and seen families sitting there where it could be a family of 5, every member is on their phone and they're not talking to each other.
I've been
That's
a part
just
of that
kind
family.
of an almost comical. Yeah. I mean, I've seen it before. We don't allow, our kids are grown and gone now, but we had rules about that kind of stuff. And, they used to complain because I didn't give my son and daughter, we didn't give them phones and stuff till way later than their friends. And, at the time they thought we were ogres, and, just honestly, they thank us now. They're so well adjusted. They completely thank us now because their friends are who had a phone at 10 they just struggle at some of the most basic things. So optics are, what optics have become is, a whole lot more about putting together a presentation that will make you popular, gain followers, subscribers, likes, positive comments, and all of that so you can feel good about yourself. The problem is what you put out to feel good about yourself isn't yourself. It's somebody else. So the whole game we're playing is a fake game to get a real reaction. Tell me, how's that going to work? How's that ever going to work?
No, that's helpful. I know I've heard sociologists start talking about how due to our ability to represent ourselves the way we can through social media, it's actually causing a subtle shift that's growing over time, namely that people are starting to operate more socially as a kind of an honor-shame culture, apart from kind of the guilty, penal, non-guilty system, because representation doesn't have necessarily anything to do with exoneration or guilt, yet we still walk away with socially discredited or elevated. So when it comes to representation there, because you spoke a bit about being made in the image of God, and social media is such a strong way to make myself into my own image. It's a tool that allows me to do that in a way that I don't know if we've ever been able to do before. And as I said in the introduction, this is a given in the upbringing of a lot of us. We just do it intuitively because it's a tool that's given to us. Do you see it as a kind of devolution in that process of kind of the Romans 1, so to speak, devolution motif there? Or do you understand it a different way when it comes to representation, optics, and being made in the image of God, and a faithful representation of confession and weakness and transparency and vulnerability and all the things that Jesus came to give us?
No, actually, that's uncanny. You're exactly right. I think I even mentioned Romans 1 in there. Romans 1 isn't an isolated incident. Like, Paul's writing to the Romans and, wow, this weird thing happened in Rome. People really started following a path where, God is obvious. They know that he's the creator, and therefore we're without excuse when we don't worship him. No, he said, actually, as you love your sin more than the obvious God that is there, this devolution happens in every culture. Every culture that follows that path is going to go along exactly that path and exactly that order. But listen to what he said was the ultimate problem in Romans 1. Through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul said it's a worship problem. In other words, he said, though they knew God, they did not worship him as God. I say it's still a worship problem. And the reason, I'm waving red flags and warnings are going off is not because I'm a paranoid person. I'm a shepherd. I'm a pastor. I love the people God has given us. And, when I see somebody playing by the freeway or by a cliff, I'm going to warn them. So here's why it's so much more dangerous today, because through manipulation and airbrushing and filtering and the words we say and what we're able to put out there, we're not just falling into a temptation to put out something that's better or different than ourselves. In return, we are setting up on some of these social media platforms little mini worship centers. And so you might, people hear that at first, they go, oh, that's kind of extreme. Come on, how are we doing that? Well, listen, if everything you're doing is no longer to connect with people and find friends, but you're literally hanging on getting more comments and likes and subscribers and all that, aren't you trying to get more people to follow you? And, as a pastor, I leverage technology to reach people for Jesus. But if that becomes a thing where, hey, I'm just trying to get more followers on Instagram, I want to really build up my social media, I want to become TikTok famous, or, whatever you want to name it, you have basically set up a little church. And your praise songs or your feedback is likes or positive comments and all that. So now here's why that matters. You and I were not created to carry the weight of worship. There's one being that can carry the weight of worship, and that's God. And so bad things happen every time when we try to worship ourselves. And ultimately, in the book I wrote, if you really want to strip everything away and get to the core problem, it is social media tempting us, and in many cases winning, in getting us to set up worship centers and then garner worship for ourselves. And that ends bad every time.
Yeah, I'd never actually thought of it in that language of kind of a profile as shrine. I'd never considered it that way. So obviously you don't think that you don't seem to think that technology is morally neutral, and you also don't seem to think that morally technology is kind of inherently evil. You see, what I hear you saying is that technology has an impact upon us, and we need to be intentional upon how we use it. So you're not trying to just get rid of it wholesale, otherwise we wouldn't be talking via Zoom. But we are talking. So how does somebody go about trying to examine whether or not social media is an idol in their life, if they're using it to
That's a good question.
Talk about Jesus for let's just say maybe beautiful motivations, or if it is a shrine unto self?
Well, at the end of every chapter in the book, I give these little self-tests, these little times of evaluation. So as you get further along in overliked, you're very clearly, in fact, there's a place where I actually have a test that you can take, and a couple of other tests recommended by other people, psychologists, that you can take to see if you have a problem. In the end, when you get to the end of the book, there are different levels. Let me back up a little bit. To answer your first question, there's a line in there, and I mean this. I am not anti-technology. I'm just pro-authenticity. I mean, yes, I use technology. In a few minutes, you're probably going to ask me how people can get a hold of me and what my social medias are. Obviously, I'm using it. And I honestly think of it in that scripture about money, because it's one of those Bible verses people get wrong all the time. They say, hey, Pastor Rob, doesn't the Bible say money's the root of all evil? Actually, no, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. So I would say God probably feels that way about technology. Technology is just technology. I mean, there are good ways to use Facebook, Instagram, any of it. Even there's probably good ways to use TikTok. That's harder to find, but there's probably good ways to leverage it for good. And I'm being, facetious. There are some really good things, good apologetics, great things on there but there's also really bad. I mean, so I would say the love of social media and the obsession would be the root of all kinds of evil. Not technology, just the love of it. Just saying, this is my God, this is my idol, this is my vehicle to garner self-worship. So we're back to that again. At the end of the book, I have this thing called the 21-day love reboot. And I would say that's good for anybody. It's like a 21-day kind of prayer and fasting deal for those that have such an issue with this and have been so hurt by it and have literally found themselves, their own self-esteem is just completely connected with how many likes or criticisms they get or bad comments. I would say you need help. I mean, if it's that obsessive with you, go through this love reboot, and honestly, you'll emerge on the other side. In fact, we do 21 days of prayer twice a year at our church. And this time, about a month ago, we finished the second one for the year, and we did the love reboot. And it was really, really good. We've done it maybe 15 times at our 21 days of prayer, but this one was helpful for a lot of people because for such a time as this, right now, the biggest issue, in fact, I'm going to 6 or 7 countries in Africa next year, where we were in Africa when the pandemic was starting, and they found out this book was coming out. And I kid you not, every country we were in, Egypt, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, every single country, when they found out, the leaders that I spoke with said, can you come back this is the biggest issue in our country. We may be one of the poorest countries, like Zimbabwe. They're very, very poor, but they said it doesn't matter. Everybody here has a phone. Everybody's got, I've been to Haiti 12 times. There are people living on the street. They still have a phone. They can't even afford any kind of covering over their head, but they're going to have a phone. And some of them are still obsessed with a phone, even though they may not be as obsessed about where their next meal is going to come from. But, take away their phone and find out how upset they get. So, all along the way, this is going to build, as I just make a case in the first third of the book. In the middle of the book, you're going to begin to take these little tests and see if you have a problem. And then I've got real quick solutions. Like I've got things you can do every day before you get online. I've got some little things you can do real quick. They take about a minute. And that way you can enter sort of the social media world with a healthy heart and a good attitude. I've got 3 or 4 of those things. I've got some other things you can take about 10 minutes to really check yourself. And then at the end of the book, like I said, there's a love reboot for those that feel like, listen, I have a huge problem. I'm in so deep, I don't know how to get out. That would be my answer to you. Read this book, take the love reboot, the 21 deal, not really test, but just, kind of a New Year's resolution thing that you can do at any time of the year. And with the power of God's word and the Holy Spirit, everybody that did it, I don't know of anyone that did this at our church that did not reemerge far more healthy in their connection with social media than when they went into this thing. So I'd highly recommend it.
Rob, I appreciate you speaking so vulnerably with us. I don't mean it for, and I'm conscientious of what I'm about to say because I don't in any way mean it for it to be backhanded. But as a pastor coming on to be vulnerable with us and share these things with us, how I want to ask 2 more questions. But for you, when did the Lord really start checking your own heart on this stuff? I know you say in the beginning of the book you dedicate it to your wife and to your kids. You say it's been a journey of 5 years, and your wife especially has been a part of writing this book as much as anyone else. Was it 5 years ago, or did the Lord long before that start really checking your heart with popularity or wanting to get kind of your name brand out there, and you starting to take a step back and wrestle with your own heart, start giving Jesus the things that were inside of it that you were starting to excavate, and then this book came out of it? How did that work together, kind of in your own life, and then into writing this book?
That's a good question. I think I don't want to say I was talked into it, but with so many people around me, in North Carolina, I still remember, man, it must have been 16, 17, 18 years ago when we had one of the largest churches, and a young pastor came to town, and he wanted to meet with me, and he wanted help and how we'd grown and all this. And I got to be careful what I say. It's all positive, so I don't know why it would be harmful to say it. But this guy ended up being someone that really taught me, even though he asked me to teach him. So he starts this little old church called Elevation in the Charlotte area. And I start meeting him for lunch. And it didn't take many lunches with him to realize this guy's got an amount of faith I've never seen before. I'm of course talking about Stephen Furtick. And he had this savvy and this understanding that was natural. It wasn't a gimmick. He wasn't using things. He just grew up. He's younger than me. And so he just knew how to use social media. So I think right there, I can remember learning from him, but being hesitant at first because I always thought, well, I don't want to get caught up in this. But because I didn't really grow up with it, I fell into a trap that I don't even think he fell into. I'm speaking for myself. As our church was one of the fastest growing churches in the country, nothing compared to Elevation. But that thing just blew up. And as I saw it, I began thinking, well, maybe that's because he does these things that I don't do. So I need to do these things. But I just know from my own heart, when I started doing some of them, sometimes I couldn't tell the difference between me trying to leverage technology to grow the church and to reach people for Jesus or to get my name out there. And if that's ever confusing for a pastor, you better check your heart. And sometimes when I checked my heart, I didn't like what I saw. I mean, it was a no-brainer. I checked my heart and I was wrong. I had to honestly say, man, I'm mad because this guy's more well-known. I'm mad because and then it's not about bringing people to the foot of the cross anymore. It's about bringing them to the foot of Facebook. And so for a while I got off. I actually got off of all social media, did a whole series on the life of King David. And I compared him to Saul. And that was my big wake-up call. I realized this isn't new. I mean, King Saul is the poster child for narcissism in the Bible. And then you got this young upstart who's the poster child of living from the heart. Was he perfect? No, he had all kinds of things go wrong. But even so, because he loved God and pursued him authentically, God blessed his life. And here's Saul. What was he? He was an ancient day people pleaser. All he wanted to do was create the optics that everybody would love. You know, what happened when people sang songs about David, where the song was more popular for David than Saul? He tried to ruin David's Facebook. I mean, that's about he tried to hack it so he wouldn't have, by hacking David, basically to pieces. So I looked at that. When I did a 10-week series on that, I thought, someday I'm gonna turn this into a book. I think the series was called Beyond the Optics many years ago. And that's basically the predecessor of what became Overliked. And I'm the guinea pig because sometimes I act more like King Saul than I do like King David. And I'm not proud of that.
Man, Rob, thank you for letting me ask that. And thanks for being candid in your response. I really appreciate it. The last question on my list that I wanted to ask is, a question I find myself asking regularly. Rob, how do you foster hope when you look at our digital age, our pornographic age, when you look at, because in some sense, it's like trying to plug holes in a dam that's splitting apart in some ways. And I think you've given us a great resource, and I hope it bears a ton of fruit. But how do you foster hope? When you look at people in restaurants, when you see families, when you go to Haiti and you see everyone on their phones, what does it look like for you before Jesus and your community to foster hope?
Wow, I wish more people would ask that question. One of the things I didn't want Overlike to become, and hopefully it never did, was just a condemnation where every chapter is, here's what's wrong with social media, and here's why we're in trouble, and here's why there's little hope. No, I mean, hopefully it's filled with hope. It's filled with humor, self-deprecating. There's plenty of material in me, but the same hope that honestly through the pages of the Psalms that King David had hasn't changed. It's the same hope that I have. And part of the Love Reboot is this: when you really make an effort to foster one relationship, in fact, I know the best way to put it. I'm so adamant about what I'm about to say that I have to undo something that's common first. Here it is. I tell people, stop putting Jesus first in your life. Then I let that sit because people think, did you just say what I think you just said it as a pastor? Yeah, I did, because I think in our culture, all that's going to do is put Jesus on a to-do list, and he's going to be number one. And so in the morning, we're going to give him the first 10 minutes, and then we're never going to take him to work or school or anything else. He's never going to be a part. So I say, make Jesus central to everything. I mean, like the sun, only you spell it S-O-N, everything, your work, your friends, your neighborhood, your hobbies, everything will then, orbit around him. That way, when you go to work, your conversations, everything you're doing, Jesus is right there with you. When you come home and you're interacting with your spouse, he's right there in that relationship. With your kids, he's right there in that relationship. And so really the hope is David went after one relationship and he got everything else thrown in. He went after this vibrant, deep relationship with his creator. And so I would tell people, man, if you just don't worry so much about getting all these people to like you or to try and be authentic online. You can only have about 50 deep, authentic relationships anyway. So if you have 500 Facebook friends, here's the truth. You don't have 500 Facebook. You have about 10. Yeah. So don't even worry about that. Put it aside. Use it to maybe get, like I do, sermons and stuff and resources out there. But the one relationship you need to worry about is in the great commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Then you'll be able to love your neighbor as yourself. Then that will spill over into everything else. And so the greatest hope I could give is if that relationship is on point, I mean, I don't have to give you hope. I don't even have to offer real hope, false hope, anything like that. Everything else is going to fall into place because you've got that orbit right. It's almost like, the old scientists and astronomer, everything, they used to think that the sun revolved around the earth, and I think that's basically, we've switched it. We've flipped. Now we think that everything revolves around us. We just need to get back to, no, we need to revolve around the SON, the sun. And that's, if you do that, if you pursue Jesus with everything you've got, there's nothing anybody could tell you that would be more valuable than that. It's the greatest hope I could give you.
Amen, Rob. Amen, dude. So two questions. One, how can people track with you and what you're doing? And two, how can we be praying for you?
Well, it's easy to track with me. Here comes the tension and the contradiction. I'm on the same social medias. It's usually Rob_Singleton. And to get the resource, the best place to go is Amazon. Just look for Rob Singleton, and you've got Audible, you've got hardback, you've got Kindle, different versions of it. And there's even a small group study guide that you can search for. So we're trying to make it so small groups can study this together, individuals can do this, read it. And then again, there are tests along the way that you can do. We do have an event coming up. My heart right now, and I would like you to pray for this, has been most of the inquiries I'm having are to speak to families. I guess I should have known that, but it's funny because a lot of grandparents and parents are buying this book and they're buying it for their kids. So the first thing I will say is you need to buy it for yourself first, because you're not going to be able to help your kids unless you see if you have a problem in this area, and then take your kids through it with you. So I've got this family event coming up October 15th, and you can go to christianparenting.org. Christy Kane is speaking there. The gal from Full House. Remember that gal?
I do. Cameron? And she's a Christian. Yes. And Cameron, yeah. Is her name Cameron? Her
last name is Cameron. I cannot remember her first name. Oh, Anthony Evans, Bob, who is the guy that wrote the Love book? Bob Goff. Bob Goff spoke to the same thing last year. Josh McDowell. They've had a lot of really great people, but it's basically this. It's 20 or 30 speakers, what every parent would want their kids to know, what every parent would want their family to know, and then each person is speaking. So I've got about a 30-minute presentation in there on this subject. Every parent, it's the whole orbit question. I'm using my book over liked, but I'm saying every parent would want their kids to know how to follow Jesus above anyone or anything else. So pray for that conference. I think it's going to be powerful. We're working on better ways to get the word out. It's only a couple of weeks away, and it's pretty cheap. It's like $40 or something. And I'll give you a link. I don't know how you'll use it on this video thing, but maybe you can put it below. And so pray for me that, there's a lot of attacks. There's a lot of, it's really interesting. We've had a lot of attacks on our social media. I've had it shut down. I've had 35 strikes on my YouTube channel, which has grown astronomically. We answer all kinds of questions, but listen, we're going to address every tough issue. I'm in a series at church called Truth and Love. We've talked about transgenderism. We've talked about racism. We've talked about abortion. So we're talking about all the things that pastors have stopped talking about. And we're getting a lot of flack here in Colorado. We're getting a lot of attacks. I've had my Instagram shut down. Now, here's the good news. I've won 34 out of 35 appeals on YouTube, but I'm thinking it's just a matter of time. I've never seen them go after a channel so hard. And I think it's because we're being so honest. We're doing it in a gracious, loving way, but please pray for that. I'm just waiting. I'm just thinking any day they're going to shut down all the social media. And I love using it to get the word about Jesus out there. They don't love to have it used that way necessarily. So yeah, a lot of spiritual attack right now.
Thanks for sharing all that, man. That's that's tender stuff, and we'll definitely be with you in prayer. And thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a delight to have you on. And just thank you, Rob.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
For sure. Guys, I hope that you enjoyed the conversation with Pastor Rob Singleton. His book is Overliked. It'll be in the link below, as well as the conference that he mentioned. We'll have a link down in the show notes. If you found this conversation valuable, share it with somebody that you think would profit from it. We're so grateful for all of you. Thank you for joining us, and we will catch you next time here on The Naked Gospel.